Good morning, I'm in Eastern Idaho. Thought I'd build on one of my other videos talking more about the platform that's needed for a large international bank to be able to develop and maintain their enterprise perspectives. In another video I talked about getting your data into the platform, and that's a big problem. That's where a lot of the problem and a lot of the time sits in order to do this transformation, because you can't buy a package with your data in it. I held to the side the issue of the platform that would manage that data. This video, let's talk about what that platform has to look like. I think there's three variables that can be controlled and have to be balanced in solving this problem. One is compute capacity, the other is window, and the third is level of desired integration and level of desired consistency. That third one really drives the level of detail you try to manage in the finance system platform. And to be honest with you, the third one is the one that you have most control of and the most variable in determining how the system will work. Out of those three, probably the least control you have over this is over the window. The way the daily financial cycle works in global financial services firms, the system has been tuned over decades, and squeezing minutes out of that schedule is difficult to do. The daily financial cycle typically looks like this. The compute capacity in an organization is usually targeted, limited in a certain sense by what's needed for customer interaction. That goes on from first thing in the morning until close the business at the end of the day. That's how much compute capacity organizations buy and large. So, but at the end of the day, that compute capacity isn't being used by customers, and so there's free space there. That free space gets used usually in organizing the data to do these data supply chains, to post transactions to balances. So this posting process begins first thing as the business closes to take transactions and post them to customer balances. Posting transactions to balances goes on for a number of hours, and it goes on parallel for all the source systems doing this work. At some point there's usually a break where there begins to be inter-system posting and clearing processes that go on, take a second sort of pass of this. All of that takes the bulk of the off hours to do. That process takes you up to 5 a.m. maybe. Well, now all of that is a customer perspective. It's not an enterprise perspective. It doesn't follow GAAP. It doesn't follow the risk rules that give the enterprises risk. It's just about the customer. So now you have about 2 hours, and you have to have the positions available for first thing in the morning. You have to know where the bank is to start business the next day. And that starts perhaps at 8 a.m., something like that, right? You have to have a little bit of backup and a recovery window in case something goes wrong there. So maybe you're at 7 a.m. you have to have this produced. So you've got from 5 to 7 a.m. Processes you're going to have to run probably will have to fit within the existing window. So that's not going to change very much. Compute capacity, we don't go spend a lot of money on compute capacity. We certainly have a lot more compute capacity today than we had 20, 30, 50 years ago, but we still try to minimize the cost of the compute capacity that we have to buy and maintain and run and service and all of that. Compute capacity is less variable than you might think it is. The thing that varies the most is the level of detail that you will maintain in the platform. And the level of detail you maintain in the platform is going to be dependent upon the level of consistency and integration you want to have across the data supply chains to be supported by the platform. If you look at today's platforms, if you held compute capacity with what you have today, and you hold the window with what you have today, you can look at the levels of detail that you're processing, and that gives you a good sense of what's possible to do with your existing tools. If we look across multiple data supply chains in an organization, there's multiple enterprise data supply chains. It takes business events and creates analytical outputs, just like a manufacturing supply chain takes raw materials and produces finished goods. If you had to build a system that targeted a single report, you would aggregate the data quickly to that report, and the compute cost would be very low to be able to fit within the window, but it would only be a single report. If you aggregate the data in a separate way for a different report, there's a possibility that the two programs come out of sync in terms of timing, in terms of rules, in terms of definition. So now these reports might be different even though they come from the same business events. And so you have independent data supply chains. That's a problem. They don't have consistency. At the bottom of the data, transactions have consistency, but once they start into the data supply chains, they divide and they diverge and they become reconciliation problems. Consistency is destroyed. Our ability to perceive the questions that sit between the data supply chains, the new questions that the systems weren't intended to answer, becomes diminished because we've aggregated out the details that are needed. So this problem of detail is really where you get to the point of what kind of consistency do you want to have? What sort of the outputs do you want to create out of this platform? How many of the data supply chains do you want to drive? The problem is that with computers, doing everything with the business events is very expensive because analytical outputs begin with a position, begin with a balance. We want to know how do we stand right now? So calculating those balances from the transactions every time for all of those perspectives is too expensive. You could do it. It would take enormous amounts of computing capacity. So we can't really use the transaction detail, even though it is a common denominator. If, however, though, we looked at balances accumulate transactions and get rid of a lot of the detail that goes on in transactions. Which balances? What is the common balance denominator across these data supply chains? It's something at the customer contract level on a daily basis. The platform needs to support notional customer contract balances with step-ups for each one of the perspectives posted on a daily basis. Okay, if you think about what that is, if you start doing the calculation, the math in your organization for what that looks like, you're taking number of customers, number of contracts, balances per contract, you'll start to end up with very large numbers if you're any size of an organization. It still is a huge number of balances compared to what our legacy enterprise systems have been maintaining. Usually in finance, they're much more highly aggregated. Number of data supply chains determines the level of detail you're going to maintain within the system. And that level of detail then becomes the objective for the system that has to run and maintain it. It has to fit within that compute capacity, it has to fit within that window, and it has to drive that level of detail. If you use existing technologies that drive your existing systems, probably measured on tens of thousands of values in hundreds of thousands of balances, maybe millions of balances, low single millions of balances. So there's where the crux of the problem comes. You have time is defined. This basically, you ought to be looking for an hour because things will take longer than you think. Don't target it for 2 hours, you'll end up with a 4-hour process. If you target it for an hour, you might end up with a 2-hour process when all is said and done. So you have 2 hours. You have the compute capacity, how much are you willing to spend in that space, and is it limited basically by what you already have in a certain sense. Then the last one is the level of detail you're going to maintain. And that's the one that becomes the most variable. Our ERP systems, which were built primarily designed based upon legacy posting processes for centuries, to be honest with you, they really run at tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, maybe in some cases millions of things an hour. But they're really not designed to run at tens of millions or more than that, which is if you're trying to get to this common denominator across a broader set of perspectives, you need something closer to tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of transactions posted to balances within that space. That's the key criteria that needs to be solved in building the platform for providing an enterprise perspective in finance systems for financial services.